Hello my class, today's lesson is going to be slightly different as today will be a history lesson. Now the story of how rugby was created has been told to death, but for those uninitiated in rugby folklore, here it is. A young English boy called William Webellis at rugby school one day during a game of football picked up the ball and started running with it, which sounds a little prickish and all but least selfish if you ask me. But anyway, the game was played and then boop, Rugby was born. But have you heard the story of how Rugby's slightly younger brother was born, and their century-long sibling rivalry? Join me, my hard-working students of the University of Rugbynomics, as we go back in time. Let's learn. So I'll set the scene for you. The year is 1871. Yes, 1871. We are back in the Stone Ages by this point, just 6 years after the abolishment of slavery, and during this time long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, in England, rugby was one code. Everyone had started agreeing that we should be playing the version of the sport played at rugby school, and many new clubs were being formed at the time, with the sport really taking a hold in the northern part of England, especially in the northern counties of Lancashire and Yorkshire, and in these counties rugby was largely seen as a working class game, whilst the south and eastern clubs were seen as more middle class, which naturally caused slight tension because when hasn't it? But anyway, support for rugby was growing larger and larger, and large paying crowds were starting to be attracted to major matches, particularly in Yorkshire, where the matches in the Yorkshire Cup soon became major events, with the English team of that era being dominated by Lancashire and Yorkshire based players. However, the newly rich game did still have points of contention, as players were slightly, and understandably in my opinion, miffed that they weren't getting a share of the money that was being made by promoters and such to watch them play. But it was argued against them that amateurism and sportsmanship were part of the game, and boy would they hold on to that sentiment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It's believed that predominantly working class players who played for teams up north found it difficult to play to their full potential, as their time to train and play was limited by work commitments, as well as the risk of injury in rugby being high, and if they were injured they had to pay their own medical bills and possibly take time off work, which for players who were mostly earning weekly wages would be a very concerning prospect financially. And like most things, it was eventually money that saw rugby divided, as in 1892 the then named English Rugby Union, and now known RFU, were laying charges of professionalism against rugby football clubs in Bradford and Leeds, both are Yorkshire clubs, BT Dubs, after they compensated players for missing work, despite the fact that the RFU were paying players who went on the 1888 British Isles tour off Australia. In 1893, with tensions still rising between the North and South, Yorkshire clubs complained that the Southern clubs were overrepresented in the RFU committee, and that committee meetings were held in London at times that made it difficult for Northern members to attend, as the issue of broken time payment, which was the proposal put forward by Yorkshire clubs that would allow players to receive payments equivalent to 33 quid a day for missing work because of match commitments, wasn't getting the traction it needed, to the detriment of Northern clubs, as the idea was voted down by the RFU, and widespread suspensions of Northern clubs and players began. Now around this time the Professional Football League was formed and was becoming a massive success, with 6 teams in the league from Northern England, and this may have inspired Northern rugby officials to form their own professional league, as 2 years later, on the 27th of August 1895, an emergency meeting was held, which is a great phrase, in Manchester, and prominent Lancashire clubs Broughton Rangers, Lee, Oldham, Rochdale Hornets, St Helens and Tydesley, Warrington, Widnes and Wigan declared that they would support their Yorkshire collies in their proposal to form their own Northern Union. Boom. This was big and slightly scandalous, which means it was sexy. Now 2 days later, on the 29th of August, representatives of 22 clubs met in the George Hotel in Huddersfield to form the Northern Rugby Football Union. The 20 clubs who agreed to resign from the Rugby Union were as follows: Bateley, Bradford, Brighhouse Rangers, Broughton Rangers, Halifax, Huddersfield, Hull, Hunslet, Leeds, Lee, Liversedge, Manningham, Oldham, Rochdale Hornets, Runcorn, Stockport, St Helens, Tydesley, Wakefield Trinity, Warrington, Widnes and Wigan. The Rugby Union authorities were mad as hell about this, to say the least, and took drastic action, issuing sanctions against clubs, players and officials involved in their new organisation. This even included amateurs who played with or against the Northern Union sides. Consequently, Northern clubs that existed purely for social and recreational rugby just went, we might as well just join the Northern Union whilst retaining amateur status, and by 1904 the new body had more clubs affiliated to it than the RFU itself. Very sexy stuff. During that year, the first international rugby league match took place in 1904 between England and the other nationalities team, mostly made up of Welsh players, and initially the Northern Union continued to play under existing RFU laws, but with the first minor change awarding a penalty for a deliberate knock-on, and other laws were gradually introduced until the arrival of the touring teams from New Zealand and Australia in 1907, which we will get to, where the major differences between the games were set in stone. Those differences were 13 players per team, as opposed to 15 in Union, the play of the ball, the heeling back of the ball after a tackle rather than the ruck, the elimination of the line-out, and a slightly different scoring structure. Now you may be wondering to yourself, how did the game spread from the north of England to places like Australia and New Zealand? Well, a year after the first International Rugby League game, the All Blacks toured Britain and witnessed the growing popularity of the Northern Union games, which basically started a chain reaction in New Zealand that mirrored what happened in England, where players turned around and went, yeah, this Northern Union version of the game seems pretty cool and hip, and yeah, we should be getting paid for murdering each other each week while everyone pays to watch. And what happened in Australia was, well, to cut a very long and convoluted story short, involving Australian entrepreneurs being contacted by All Blacks about making the game professional, a conflict growing over players not getting cuts for big match profits, and players getting injured and not being able to afford medical bills. Basically, the Northern Union style of the game got a hell of a lot of steam behind it down under, with the New South Wales Rugby Football League being formed to organise professional rugby in Australia on the 8th of August 1907, with the league also announcing that the game would be played under Northern Union rules. But this Australian expansion of the game went a lot better than anyone could have hoped for, as with the game being professional, recruiting players for the new form of the game was actually quite easy, despite the threat of immediate and lifetime expulsion from the New South Wales Rugby Union, as they could basically just say, yeah, it doesn't matter if you expel me, because I'm getting paid. And as a massive statement of intent, they signed the most famous rugby player in Sydney at the time, Herbert Messenger. After that, Australian Rugby Union and Rugby League had similar gate receipts, and by 1910 leagues had doubled, and then by 1913 Rugby Union's receipts were less than 10% of their league counterparts, and league basically almost put Rugby Union out of business in Australia. Union had to relinquish leases on major sporting grounds, with most being taken over by Rugby League, which is part of the reason why Rugby League is so massive in Australia compared to its Union brother. A Queensland Rugby Football Association was founded whilst all this was going on, and representative matches began to be played between them and New South Wales as selection trials for the national team. This would then evolve to become, in my opinion, the coolest spectacle in Rugby League, the State of Origin series. As it became obvious that the two codes of rugby were going to coexist for the foreseeable future, those interested in the game needed to be able to distinguish between them. So it became customary to describe those teams affiliated to the NU as playing in the league, hence Rugby League, whilst those which remained playing by the rules of the Rugby Football Union as playing Rugby Union, which all sounds very proper. The early years of the 20th century also saw attempts to establish the game in Wales, with several teams being formed in the Principality. None of these ventures lasted long, however Wales remained a source of playing talent for Rugby League. Over the years, many hundreds of Welsh Rugby Union players moved north to the major English clubs, attracted by the opportunity to earn money playing rugby. It was not until recently that this stopped, with rugby going pro in the late 20th century, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, the game continued to spread through other countries, especially France, who after years of Rugby Union authorities suspecting the French Rugby Union of abusing the idea of amateurism, read into that what you will, were suspended against playing other nations in the early 1930s, which left French players looking around for an alternative. Many French players turned to Rugby League, which soon became the dominant game in France, particularly in the southwest of the country. But World War II had serious implications for Rugby League in France, as the Vichy regime banned Rugby League and forced players and clubs and officials to switch codes to Union. Assets of the Rugby League and its clubs were handed over to Union. The consequences of this action still reverberate. The assets were never returned, and although the ban on Rugby League was lifted, it was prevented from calling itself rugby from 1949 to the mid-1980s, having to use the game Jeu à 13, meaning game of 13, which really stunted the growth of the game in France. Rugby League formed its own international federation after the war in the 1950s, and from that point the game seemed to drift further and further apart, with the game gradually spreading its way through the Pacific Islands, countries like Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, even Papua New Guinea, all taking to the sport of Rugby League, and of course the obvious player poaching still rampant from both Union and League respectively. And speaking of players switching codes, I want to speak about why this would happen and what skills can be transferred over. So these sports may be similar, but they are also extremely different in terms of skills and specialities and positions, with rugby union very much having specialist skills needed in most of the forward positions at the top level. So you won't see many tight heads or second rows going to play rugby league unless they are outrageously physically gifted. But in rugby league, most of the ball in hand skill and physicality of players in rugby league can be transferred over to play in the backs, with big forwards in rugby league being excellent 12s and backs outside of the halfbacks having extremely similar jobs across codes, and this meant that players playing and switching between rugby league and union was extremely common, with the lure of professionalism being on rugby league side and the slightly slower paced and less physically taxing game being offered on union side. And all of that switching fell into even more chaos, as in 1995, after the Rugby World Cup in South Africa, rugby union turned professional. And with rugby union going pro, several high profile league players changed codes, and the floodgates, weren't well and truly open, but were open enough to be interesting, especially in Australia, where the Australian Rugby Union administrators appeared to be targeting league internationals. Wendell Saylor, Matt Rogers, Lottie Takiri all switched and soon represented the Wallabies. Other high-profile players such as Jason Robertson, Yeston Harris, Henry Poole. Eventually, the flow of rugby league players moving on big money contracts to unions seemed to have been stabilised. And in fact, in many cases, this actually proved to be a positive for rugby league, with the money gained from transfer fees being used to fund the expansion of the game. And that's how the game has pretty much stayed, with the odd big money move here and there, and both games trying to grow globally, with Toronto joining the British Rugby League system in 2017, and the same year the announcement of the MLR, the American Fully Professional Rugby Union League. But over the course of researching this video, I can't help but be saddened that the sport did have to split in two, as this relationship, especially in the beginning, seems to be one where two things that are trying to grow are constantly pulling the other down to try and get ahead. And I can't help think about how big the sport could have been. Union will always be my preferred option, but that's just because I grew up watching it, and I hope there's more people growing up who can love both codes equally. There's obviously things and ideas that both codes can learn from one another, like rugby needs an all-star origin type thing ASAP, but that might be a ways off, and it's got me thinking what else could be holding the game back. But that's a lesson for another time, and that concludes today's lesson on rugby league's history with rugby union. I really hope you enjoyed today's class. Signed NGJ. But God, I wish rugby union was as simple to understand as league though. Jesus. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're new here, please subscribe with the notify bell on to stay updated. Take it easy guys, and I'll see you around.